It was August of 1993, summertime, when 6 youthful and adventurous acquaintances, all with a love of the outdoors and a passion for backpacking, embarked on an excursion most nature lovers could only dream of. But what started as a relatively easy hike soon turned deadly when sudden and unexplained symptoms mysteriously took the lives of 6 of the 7 group members. Back in the 90s, and still today, though the trend has lessened somewhat, tourists from all over Russia and Ukraine would descend in groups upon the Siberian Khamar Daban mountain range to explore its mostly coniferous forests with swaths of cedar trees and beautiful natural freshwater lakes. The mountain range wraps around the Pearl of Siberia, which holds about 20% of the world's fresh surface water, more water than all of the North American Great Lakes combined. Still today, thousands of tourists embark to these mountains every year to witness the natural wonders of the Siberian wilderness. The 6 capable and nearly lifelong hikers were tourists from Petropavlovsk, Russia, between the ages of 15 and 24. Though they were young, all 6 had participated in extended hikes and survival excursions of various difficulties before. Their chosen adventure? To traverse the Khamar Daban Mountains in Siberia, one of the first mountains to be written about in history and the oldest mapped landmass in the world. Because the mountain range encircles Lake Baikal from the south, it is home to scenic vistas. It is easy to access by plane, a unique feature that enables more people to traverse its sloping hills and steep peaks. But this particular unlucky group would soon encounter mysterious and unexplained forces, which quickly led to the death of all but one of the hikers. The energetic group of 6 was led by well-known and expert guide Ludmila Ivanova Korovina. Remembered as, quote, beautiful, strong-willed, and athletic, Korovina was a 41-year-old expert survivalist and head of the Petropavlovsk Tourist Club Azimut, part of a larger school for the outdoors. Her reputation as a world-class leader and wilderness teacher preceded her, and tourists would travel long distances to hike with her. She had trained heavily for years, and though she occasionally was criticized for being too survivalist in her methods, former students would fly great lengths to be taken under her capable wing across dangerous mountain treks. One of her former members of the hiking team said, quote, she knew how to unite everyone, make a team. She believed in people. She could make a person become who he really is. Under her mentoring, each of us managed to maximize our abilities, grow in all spheres of life. The group members Korovina led ranged in age from 15 to 24. The eldest of the hiking tourists was Tatiana Filipenko, 24. Then there was Alexander Sasha Kresin, 23, who was not just another tourist, but what some would call an adopted son of Korovina's. The 23-year-old, nicknamed Sasha, which is a common nickname for Alexander in Russia, had been taken under the wing of Korovina and was not only familiar with her techniques and tactics when it came to the outdoors, but was also a cherished family friend. The other members consisted of Denis Vachin, 19, Valentina Valia Yudachenko, 17, as well as Victoria Vika Zalazova, 16, who was the least trained of the group. The 16-year-old was actually the friend of another one of the group members, and while she had hiking trips under her belt, it was not as many as the others. Initially, Korovina was hesitant to take Vika because, admittedly, even by her friend's own accounts, she was known to be quite verbal in her occasional complaints. Nevertheless, she was invited along. The youngest member of the fated group was 15-year-old Khamar Daban, also highly trained for his age. By the end of the trip, only one of the 7 group members would live to tell the harrowing tale. Victoria, Dennis, Alexander, Tamir, Tatiana, Val, and their experienced leader, Korovina, departed around August 1st, though it may have been on the 2nd, as accounts with exact dates are varied. The group started their adventure from the village of Moreno. They made their way through the Langutai Gates Gorge, and eventually they got to the highest point of their trek and ascended the highest mountain in the range, called Kanulu. Then, the group started on the downward part of their journey. They passed the Antigua and Baija rivers and then hiked on to the watershed plateau. They reached this area on or around August 4th. By this time, the group had been traveling for many days, and reports say they covered over 70 kilometers of ground, nearly 44 miles of terrain, in what was classified as a level 3 trek. There are 5 hiking difficulty levels, so this particular route was challenging and not for the faint of heart, but also not the most difficult, or even the second most difficult, by far. They spent the day foraging, cutting, and drying goldenroot, a type of medicinal plant. They then stopped at the summit, which was in between the 2 peaks of Faliot-Yaganli, which is about 2,204 meters high, and Tiliat-Tranyas, which is about 2,310 meters high. At this point, the group was about 7,545 feet up in altitude. They made camp in what some say was an unexpected place. This ridge was a plateau, devoid of any cover or any natural shelter from the increasingly powerful wind. Those familiar with the location that the group stopped to rest at say it's almost Martian in its appearance. Rocks, dry grass, and the roaring wind was all there was in this sloped area, and many question why the group chose to camp in this location, instead of in the relatively nearby grove of trees, offering far more protection from the increasingly inclement weather, and located only 4 kilometers, about 2.5 miles away. Access to the much safer tree-covered environment would require that the group descend about 400 meters, a little over 1,300 feet, into the lower forest zone. Local rescuers say that there was also another option for the group to get dry and find shelter from the monstrous storm that was now descending upon the unexpected hikers. They could climb to the top of the closest mountain, where a special platform had been erected as an emergency shelter for tourists. At this location, there would have been dry firewood and a place to rest. It would be only 30 minutes to get to this point. However, for reasons unknown to the investigators, that area was not chosen by Korovina as a resting point, a decision which baffled many. Hindsight critics wonder why Korovina didn't attempt to make camp in the nearby grove of trees. Those familiar with Korovina's pedagogy speculate that she may have intentionally chosen the ridge as a resting place because she wanted to show the team how to survive in those types of conditions. However, there is a far sadder and more complex theory. Some wonder if the reason they stopped in such an open and barren landscape with no cover was because deviating would have taken them further off of the designated path where Korovina was to meet up with another hiking group, and that deviation from the planned route may have delayed them reaching their set meeting point and meeting up with the group. Korovina was actually helping 2 groups plan their hike simultaneously, a semi-regular occurrence on long backpacking trips in the region. This particular hike was actually going to be part of a multi-group hike that would culminate in the hikers meeting up with each other at strategic points. In what could only be described as a cruel coincidence, Korovina's own daughter was actually the leader of the other hiking group, the group that Korovina was planning on meeting up with. Although the two group leaders did not have walkie-talkies, they had approximately 4 intersections on the hiking trail where they were planning on meeting up with the other hiking group. These certain points they believed sufficient in keeping up the line of communication if something were to go wrong. Like mother, like daughter, both women were highly experienced, and their goal was to have each of their groups intersect to meet up and hike the remaining miles together in what would have been a mother-daughter adventure not soon forgotten. Instead of meeting up with her mother, though, figuring that the weather had disrupted their plans, Corvina's daughter and their hiking group continued on, and the 16-year-old flew back to her hometown of Kazakhstan not knowing that her mother had passed away in the very vicinity and the same time that she was hiking. The area the hikers were traversing was more of a dome than a steep peak, and being that it was summertime, the weather conditions were predicted to be mild. Unfortunately, despite the fact that Corvina had studiously checked the weather conditions and projections prior to departure, the group was greeted on their 3rd day by freezing rain and light snowfall. Unbeknownst to them, a Mongolian cyclone had descended upon the Irkutsk region on August 3rd, which was contrary to the previous weather projections that Corvina had received. The formation of the shockingly strong surface winds caused by the passage of a cyclonic cold front took the hikers by surprise, and by nightfall the wind had become terroristic and oppressive in its unyielding nature. Their trek took them on the border of 2 climate zones, the West Siberian Plains and Mongolia, to the south of Lake Baikal, and in both zones the weather phenomenon of cyclogenesis can be created. This summertime event was unexpected based on forecasts, but not rare for the region. Because of the lack of internet technology at the time, the exact temperatures for that day are unknown. While publicly accessible weather histories of the Irkutsk region only go back as far as 1999, a look at the average temperatures historically show no instances of extreme cold in the month of August. Data for the Irkutsk region state that the average low is only 11 degrees Celsius, and the average high is around 21 degrees Celsius. This means that historically the region did not get below 50 degrees Fahrenheit. However warm the temperature was forecasted to be, the group was prepared for rain in general, as the region averaged 15 days of rain in the month of August, with Siberia experiencing the most rain in the summer months. So, while the cyclone was unexpected in its ferocity, the group was prepared to encounter rain overall and did indeed have the proper supplies and clothing. At 4 in the morning on August 5th, the seams of the hikers' tents, already tight from being blown in the wind and close to breaking, burst, and while the experienced group fixed what material they could, the wind and dew persisted through the damaged tents, and at 6 a.m. they awoke again to wet sleeping bags and decided to begin their day, as sleep was not going to come with their dampness. At around 11 a.m. on August 5th, a wet and weather-beaten group broke down the already very broken-down campsite and started walking again. Prior to the time that the group was able to pack up and leave, Sasha, the 24-year-old, walked up to one of the tents and complained, presumably to Corvina, of feeling ill. Despite feeling unwell, his symptoms not specified, Sasha decided to press on with the group in hopes of traversing more ground and completing yet another hike. Unfortunately, within the first few kilometers of the group's hike, Sasha started to stumble and fall. Sasha fell multiple times until he became so weak that everyone else in the group had to take on his pack load and help him along. Sasha, the oldest male of the group at age 24 and Corvina's so-called adopted son, then began bleeding from the ears and started foaming at the mouth. Alarmed, Corvina decided to stay back with Sasha and administer aid. She encouraged the remaining 2 men, one only 15 and the other 19 years old, to lead the rest of the group to the tree line below in order to dry off and hopefully get their firewood to a state that it was able to be burned. However, halfway to the forest's edge, the group turned back, Why specifically is unknown, but it can be assumed that something felt very wrong and the young adults wanted to be close to their leader. One of the group members, Tatiana, brought Corvina a tent in hopes of erecting a temporary shelter from the now roaring storm that had descended upon the valley. When the group looked to Sasha for his condition, they saw his eyes were wide and dark and his pupils dilated. When Tatiana tried to get the now unresponsive Sasha moved under a tent to partially protect him from the oppressive wind, Val tried to help her, but Corvina told them both to stop what they were doing and go straight to the trees and seek shelter. Upon hearing this, Val, 17, grabbed her friend Victoria, 16, to bring her along to the shelter of the forest, but Victoria proceeded to bite Val's hand in response. Shocked but not deterred, Val had to drag the now incomprehensible teen by her hair to the resting point, with Victoria fighting and kicking back most of the way. Val, not yet to the trees because of the now hostile Victoria, turned back around to seek out Corvina, this time to complain that Victoria was not being cooperative in getting to the trees. When Val returned to the group members, she came upon a startling scene. Tatiana was bent double, intentionally banging her own head against the rocks, over and over again. Val then looked to Tamir, the 15-year-old, who was grasping at his throat like he couldn't breathe. He soon collapsed. Dennis, the 19-year-old, screamed at Val to grab sleeping supplies and get to the shelter quickly. But when she looked back to reply, she watched him drop the sleeping bag he had just retrieved and fall to the ground, violently writhing and ripping at the clasps of his clothes, just as the other 5 had done. When Val tried to help him, he too fought her off, kicking, adamant in his refusal for her assistance. Bleeding profusely from the ears and foaming at the mouth, 6 of the 7 members of the group had now descended into what could only be described as madness, witnessed only by one unscathed and uncertain 17-year-old. Some of the group members were hiding behind rocks. One had slunk into their sleeping bag, panic-stricken. Others ran around aimlessly. Val stood helpless as the whole group writhed on the floor, banging their heads against the rocks and the ground, and ripping and tearing at their clothes. Some of the members, now in partial states of undress, gradually stopped moving, while others continued to shake and move about. Knowing she was incapable of helping more than she already had, Val grabbed enough supplies to temporarily survive the storm and headed to the tree line. There she made enough of an awning underneath the cover of a stone to keep the wind at bay, and eventually she fell into a not-so-restful sleep. The next morning, after the storm had passed, Val went back to investigate her groupmate's condition. She found that at least 5 of the 6 group members had passed away in the night. She later recalls that upon returning to their bodies, she did not expect anyone to be alive, because the symptoms exhibited that night prior seemed fatal, but that she needed both closure and supplies. While some reports say that Val closed each of her fellow friends' eyes, what she actually said became lost in translation in the media, and what she purportedly said, according to a local Russian translator, was not that she closed their eyes, but that she closed or averted her own eyes from the dead. Some sources say that at this point, the morning after the mass psychosis exhibited by the group, that the group leader Corvina was still alive and able to feebly give Val directions on how to escape the mountains. But this is not repeated in other sources, so that detail is still in debate. What is known is that the 17-year-old then took a compass, food rations, and other survival tools from the bag of the deceased group leader and set out to find the Anikta River, a known landmark to the young woman, who is now traversing alone. The nearby river was too rough to cross, so Val camped out for the night near an electric tower. When the sun rose the next morning, she saw that there were wires running from the electric tower. Val attempted to find safety in civilization by visually tracing and following the electric cables and wires which brought service to some of the most remote parts of Siberia. But unfortunately, the cables just ended at a remote and abandoned town devoid of occupants, food, or phone service. Let down by the false promise of hope from the presence of electric wires in a town long abandoned, Val then attempted to follow the water pipes which flowed from the empty village. That led her to a nearby river, where she then became so exhausted from her 3-day trek that she stopped to rest, hanging her white t-shirt on the limbs of a tree to dry out. Knowing that she had little food and light warmth for survival, the haggard and weary teenager later recalled that at that point, she was preparing herself for death. As luck would have it, tourists from Kiev, Ukraine, who were out rafting, saw Val on the riverbanks. Initially, they were not alarmed as the 17-year-old made no attempt whatsoever to call out to them and didn't show outward signs of distress. Eventually, the tourists' consciousness got the better of them, and they turned around to check on the lone teenager and make sure that she was safe. At this point, logic had come back to Val, and she was waving at them furiously. Upon their approach, she rushed at them, crying that people were dead and she was scared. She was taken by the concerned tourists to a local hospital, and authorities were contacted. After her initial outcry, she clammed up and became almost catatonic once safe in the hospital. This type of reaction is common for someone who has just exerted a high amount of adrenaline for an extended period of time. At the hospital, Val was at first reticent to share her story with the investigators, but eventually, some of the details came out, however murky. These details, given by Val, and the recollections of her rescue and outcry to the tourists, were the only ones that the media had access to, and some of the only immediate accounts of the incident. For this reason, some details may have been slightly altered, or possibly lost in translation. The bodies of the 6 group members had to remain alone for weeks, visited only by scavengers, until August 26th, although some reports say it was the 21st, because the mountains were far too windy and dangerous to find and recover the bodies safely. Members of the search and rescue party sent to the scene of the incident by helicopter recall that the bodies were paired off in smaller groups, scattered across 40 to 50 meters of ground. The 6 hikers, previously young, strong, virulent, and full of life, were now reduced to bloated and swollen corpses, with death-imprinted grimaces on their faces and in partial states of undress of their many layers, with some only wearing their thin, full-bodied undergarments. 3 of the stricken were without shoes, a fact which lined up with Val's recollection of the hikers desperately ripping off their garments. Workers recall that Korovina was lying on top of Sasha, possibly in one last act of protection. Rescue workers recall that scavengers had eaten their eyes and tongues, as the soft tissue is a common target after death. The condition of the bodies left little artifacts for the coroner to examine, and the windstorm that had ravaged the area had likely swept away any non-bodily evidence from the scene. The official autopsy reports done in the city of Ulan-Ude in East Siberia state that the cause of death for all 6 hikers was hypothermia. Friends and family took umbrage at the obvious elephant in the room. It seemed very suspicious that, given the area's annual highs and lows for the time of year, the lows for the area averaged in the 50s at night, roughly 10 degrees Celsius, that the hikers simply froze to death in the summertime, while one person, a 17-year-old teenager at that, one who was not the biggest nor the strongest of the group, would survive, and not only survive but do so for an additional 3 days, and be seemingly unaffected whatsoever and cognitively sound, seemed unbelievable for those left behind, who were filled with questions and uncertainty. In support of the hypothermia theory, it had been raining for more than 24 hours at the point that the group members started exhibiting symptoms. That, combined with the wind chill factor, would have led to very cold conditions. Because human bodies experiencing hypothermia feel like they're warm, but they're actually going into a state of shock, there have been documented cases of hypothermic patients ripping at their clothes, feeling like they're too warm, rather than actually currently freezing to death. Some say the fact that the hikers ripped their clothes off demonstrated that they were experiencing that type of sensation. Besides this symptom, however, the theory seems to have few parallels with the horrors witnessed by Val, namely the bleeding from the ears, foaming at the mouth, and banging one's head against the rocks. Nowhere in any documented cases of hypothermic patients were such antics observed. Quite to the contrary, in fact, people freezing to death often become slower and more lethargic over time, and eventually stop to take their final rest and pass without violent or even visible symptoms. Additionally, while the weather was inclement and stormy, it was still August, summertime. It was not the dead of winter or even in the winter months. Additionally, experts claim that hypothermia being the cause of death does not make sense because that area was not a desert where temperatures can fluctuate rapidly, and as it was August in a forest, the elements, however unyielding, could not have caused such an instantaneous cold with such fatal results. Theories are varied, but with the limited press coverage of this particular incident and the lack of information from Val, theories are all the families of survivors have to hold on to in hopes of receiving some sort of explanation or closure. Later, in what some would say is victim blaming, but others say is just common sense, it is said that in Corvina's insistence that they stay on schedule so as to meet up with her daughter and their hiking group on time, and to not miss the allotted intersection window, that she made a rash decision which snowballed into a series of fatal mistakes, which led to the death of her charges. Critics say that her unwillingness to traverse a couple miles out of the way in order to seek shelter in the trees could be reasoned as a major contributing factor to the exposure death. But none of this explains why the group members were foaming at the mouth or bleeding from the ears, as that is not a known symptom of exposure. One theory is that the KGB, the Russian Committee for State Security, was testing some new type of weapon, possibly sound or nuclear-based. Some wonder if this could have been a type of weapon which could incapacitate and cause fatalities from some distance away. There is also speculation that a nerve agent of some sort could have been either knowingly or unknowingly unleashed on the unsuspecting campers, as bleeding from the ears is a common symptom of nerve agents. This theory is fueled by the strangeness of the lack of details and the inconsistencies in official reports and media coverage. This conspiracy speculates that Val, as the only witness to the hypothetical government activities, was paid off, and that is the reasoning behind her decision to move far away, and her reluctance to discuss the matter. This type of hypothetical weapon, however, doesn't explain why Val was unharmed in the supposed testing, and this theory is more based on conspiracy rather than any concrete evidence. Some postulate that the group's symptoms could align with the consumption of poison mushrooms or some other food-based toxin. Others wonder if their water was contaminated. Some asked if the stew that they consumed as their last meal contained toxins in some form, but doctors interviewed stressed that due to different body metabolism and different enzymatic reactions, that kind of food-based sickness or poisoning would affect each in a slightly different way and at different times, not so synchronously as Val recalls it. No evidence of a food-based illness existed in the autopsy report, and Val recalls that she and the group members shared all food. In response to the fact that they all shared the same food, those researching the case wonder if Val was protected somehow, perhaps by a secret Corvina was hiding in her rucksack. Some wonder if the sole survivor, Val, may have been the only one to eat the so-called golden root plant that Corvina had been surreptitiously collecting along their trip, an act that possibly protected Val from whatever harm befell the group, be it from a natural or man-made source. Golden root, its scientific name Rhodiola rosea, is a perennial that grows in the wild in the mountains of Siberia. The raw roots are said to be limitless in their potential for medicinal use. In the early 50s, Russian scientists classified golden root as a, quote, adaptogen because it has the potential to create a bodily resistance to certain toxins and supports one's adaptation to various stressors that might befall the taker. The golden root also contains a chemical called sildenafil. Sildenafil is the active ingredient in the ED drug Viagra. For this reason, the root has a high resale value, especially in remote areas without access to prescription drugs. Golden root has an incredibly slow pattern of growth and only has the potential to help people medicinally when fully matured, after nearly 12 years of growth. This long growing period and the root's presence in limited regions makes fully grown golden roots highly valuable and sought after. Rescue workers found a bag of these roots, and some say that this amount shows that Corvina took more than needed, ostensibly to sell for profit. While some theorize that the consumption of this root was beneficial to Val in that it possibly saved her life, others wonder if the plant was actually the root of all their problems. Those indigenous to the area believe that the golden root has mystical properties, and Siberian folklore states that those who take more than they need for just personal consumption will be spiritually punished. Due to a lack of access to official statements, it is unknown whether Val actually consumed the roots and if they aided her somehow. Was there another death on the mountain? Did another person die on the mountain with the same symptoms of foaming at the mouth and bleeding from the ears? Some sources report that another fatality may have occurred on the same mountain. But no more information is given, and coverage is not only suspiciously light on the actual group's incident, but also in Russian and therefore translated through Google Translate by those who wish to research the incident decades later. Friends of Corvina admit that while Corvina could be extreme in her approach to survivalism, employing tactics that would help the group if they ever encountered an emergency situation, those close to her say that Corvina never took outdoor education to the extreme that her charges would be in danger. A Russian media source initially claimed that the group was food insecure, claiming that the presence of a single soup can and a small tin of meat left at the campsite shows that the group was running on empty, though most unlikely. The medical examiner considered it because of the absence of insulin in post-mortem blood samples of the victims. The only other medical reason that could explain this lack of glucose in the blood of the deceased, however, would be similar to a diabetic-like type of insulin resistance, but how that could have affected an entire group is unknown. The first issue with the theory that the group was experiencing the effects of malnutrition is that the media source was basing their assumptions on the presence or lack thereof of food waste at the campsite. But those in the backpacking community understand that the best and most respectful hikers always pack out their trash so as to avoid contaminating the area. And because the scene of the incident was not sealed nor protected from the elements for many weeks, it's possible that scavengers and the weather took what remained of the group's food rations and waste. Moreover, it's only logical to think that even if the group was malnourished, they would have slowly wasted away and would not have gone wild, banging their heads against the rocks and bleeding from the ears. No publications on those types of symptoms occurring in the actions of those who have starved to death exist, as mania and orifice bleeding are not symptoms of starvation. For this reason, the theory of malnutrition is not one taken seriously, and mostly originated in the original Russian media write-ups that relied heavily on secondhand information of the search group, and not from Val herself. This reliance on secondhand information caused the media to make sweeping assumptions without ever knowing the history of Korovina or her skill sets and methodology. A friend recalls that Korovina was a stickler for survivalist learning, but she was also someone who would have insisted the hikers be nourished before pressing on, and would not have allowed the young hikers to become so malnourished that they encountered death. Many speak of the professionalism of Korovina, as she was all about triple-checking the supplies. Val, the survivor of the group, says that they planned to have enough food to consume 2,400 calories a day, and that food was not a factor in their untimely demise. The tallest part of the mountain the group climbed that day reached a peak of 2,396 meters. And when the group stopped to rest, they were at 2,300 meters, which is about 7,545 feet above sea level. A high altitude, but not one so high that it would cause such extreme illness. For comparison purposes, the lodge at Heavenly in South Lake Tahoe, a common respite for people of all health and ability levels, as well as by families with children, has a base altitude of around 2,000 meters, 6,000 feet, and peaks just above 3,068 meters, or around 10,000 feet. This resort and its slopes are enjoyed by those who have driven from San Francisco, a sea-level city, the same day. And while altitude sickness can happen at the resort's highest peaks, it is never as extreme as what the group experienced. Moreover, in the South Lake Tahoe Lodge, at the base level of the resort where the hotel is located, which is an almost exact altitude to what the stricken hikers were experiencing, altitude sickness is almost unheard of. And when it manifests itself, it's usually in the form of a headache or light nausea, remedied often by only water. High-altitude pulmonary edema can cause bleeding from the eyes, but bleeding from the ears is not mentioned in the symptoms. Moreover, high-altitude pulmonary edema, or cerebral edema, often causes symptoms closer to drunkenness rather than rage, violence, or panic. While the hiker's hometown of Petropavlovsk is only 150 meters, roughly 500 feet above sea level, the hikers had almost a week to acclimate to the increased altitude, so the claims that they could have been sickened with extreme altitude poisoning is doubted by many. Additionally, altitude sickness affects everybody differently, depending on many factors. So the fact that all of the group members went mad and were sickened at relatively the same time is not conducive to altitude sickness. Many believe the lack of correlation with the known symptoms of altitude sickness and the data of the hikers' trek upwards show that a force other than the altitude was responsible for the death of 6 previously joyous adventurers. What many believe to be the most logical and explanatory theory, while still not completely perfect in its explanation, lies in the hidden and largely untapped power of sound as a weapon. Some wonder if the Mongolian cyclone which overtook the area was actually an anticyclone. While a cyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a center of low atmospheric pressure, an anticyclone is a system of winds which rotate around a high atmospheric pressure, with varied results. Some theorize that this particular anticyclone caused such an intense wind that magnetic vibrations began to descend upon the hikers, and when combined with the strong air currents, it set in motion a strange and largely obscure phenomenon called infrasound. While sound has been publicly investigated as a weapon of war from as early as 1957, but most likely far before that in sealed military research, this particular instance of infrasound is hypothesized to have been created by the wind, and that the wind created such a low noise that it became unsettling and possibly fatal. According to one article, the large boulders present on the ridge that the hikers stopped to rest on when hit with unusually strong winds at a certain angle, can become a, quote, infrasonic generator of enormous power, which causes a person to experience a state of panic and unaccountable horror. Because airborne sound of sufficient intensity enters the body by direct absorption, and in turn stimulates the non-auditory tissue, infrasound can produce physiological effects, essentially similar to a whole-body seizure. This low-frequency noise can be perceived by the brain but not by the ears on a conscious level. When exposed to these types of sounds, the human body has the potential to react to a noise of which it does not actually realize it is hearing. Such a sensation can lead to strange feelings of terror and panic, similar to what Val recalls witnessing. Experts researching infrasound for military-grade weapons explain that the high-intensity acoustic energy can have a myriad of consequences. It can affect one's hearing, either temporarily or permanently. It can cause increases in the heart rate and blood pressure, as well as pain, vertigo, nausea, and vomiting. According to scientists looking at infrasound as a weapon, the most dangerous frequency of sound for the brain to experience is one that mirrors the, quote, median alpha rhythm frequencies of the brain, which is 7 Hz. The article goes on to state that the reason for the high level of danger associated with this incredibly low frequency is that 7 Hz is also the resonant frequency of the body's own organs. So this sound can directly affect the human central nervous system. Current literature on the subject says that exposure to low-frequency acoustic energy could result in disorientation, and with that, an understandable amount of panic and anxiety. Along with those common symptoms, more physical responses to this low frequency of below 7 Hz sound has been experienced with more side effects such as bowel spasms, nausea, vomiting, collapsed lungs, and even, when exposed to the sound long enough, organ rupture and death. Restlessness and confused speech was present in the 6 victims, according to Val, along with disorientation and anxiety. But notably missing from the slew of symptoms of infrasound is the bleeding from the ears. The effects of infrasound at high altitudes has also not been explored, because the mechanisms of such scientific inquiry are complicated. As many would say, inflicting such sounds on those animals closest to humans for scientific purposes is unnecessarily cruel. As human test subjects are not queuing up to be exposed to such damaging sensations, and at a high altitude to boot, our knowledge of the intricacies of infrasound are limited at best, and therefore there could be symptoms to which we are not privy. Because each human brain and nervous system is unique in its capabilities and perceptions, not everyone is affected by infrasound in the same ways, which could be why Val was not a victim. Her age, gender, and bodily capabilities may have precluded her from such forces and symptoms. Because sound affects different people in different ways, this could be the reason that Sasha started to get sick first, and that the others followed shortly after. Perhaps Sasha was more affected by the frequency due to his age and gender. He was the oldest male on the trip. Speculation is all that remains of this tragedy, as it is considered a closed case due to the coroner's contention that the deaths were caused by hypothermia. For now, at least, the friends and families of these 6 beloved explorers will continue to wonder what unexpected fate befell them. Even years later, Val refuses to discuss the tragedy with reporters, saying once in a response to a request for an interview, quote, "Do you think I want to remember this nightmare? I had to leave, change my whole life. I don't want to remember it."